Now, before we even start rigging him, it's pretty important that we test to make sure his scale is correct. People like to forget this step. They're like, I swear I did it correctly. I don't have to worry about it. But realistically, if you're not careful, you can cause yourself so much heartache and so many problems in your pipe. It's always good to test. So I'm going to call this skbob fbx export, export him. And we're going to go into Unreal. I'm going to create a new Unreal project. We'll create a third person project because by the end of this, we will have our animations working on the third person character. So we're going to call this character animation tests. And it says that it can't be that long. So we will just call it character anim test. And in fact, we'll just do char anim test. Okay. There we go. Beautiful new project. Now our other project's open. We're going to go ahead and go to the main content folder. We're going to create a new folder called Bob. And in there, we are going to import our skeletal mesh, which right now will come in as a static mesh because he's not rigged or anything like that. And that's fine. We're literally just testing him. Like the modelers handed him off to us. And we're saying, okay, well, we better make sure everything's correct on him. Ideally, he would also have a good material name. If he didn't, I would figure out what was wrong there. But assuming he did and everything was good, I would bring him in and I would say, okay, let's see how he looks. Now, something I noticed right away is his pivot is off, which we can fix in a second. But his scale looks pretty good. If I come in here and play the game, I bet you he's pretty darn close. Yep. That's because we did the box method correctly. You definitely tell he has very stylized proportions. It's not very realistic. That is okay. That doesn't matter for us. I mean, what if we were bringing in an orc, right, or something else? Those things don't matter for what we're doing. But let's go ahead and go back to this. And let's say, why is his pivot off? Well, if you've watched my other videos, you'll know that what I did was I missed, and I thought this was the center of the grid, when in reality, this is the center of the grid. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this because I really prefer it to be way more obvious where the center of the grid is. Like now it's like super obvious, and I get it. It's kind of overwhelming. But that's okay, because when I don't want to see it, I can just flip the grid off. But at least now I know it's in the correct spot. I'm going to go ahead and save Bob, and I'm also going to export him. skbob. Go back into Unreal. This is common. You're going to run into issues. Re-importing, not a big deal. You get used to it. You do it a lot. There we go. Look at that. He's good to go. Now, again, if you haven't watched my other video, you might be saying, well, why is the pivot on the bottom? It's always the center of the grid. Not going to go into it more than that. You should watch my other video if you really want to understand it. Okay, so here he is. He's good to go. We've tested him on Unreal. Now, I'm going to immediately freeze transformations, which I should have even done sooner. Non-deformer history, delete all history on him and save, because I want to make sure he's zeroed out before we rig, right? Now, I'm going to use quick rig, and I'm also going to go ahead and turn off the grid for now. So I am going to switch into rigging mode, and we're going to go to skeleton, quick rig. You can see this window right here. One-click auto rig, not the best idea. You want step by step. And we're going to click step by step, then we're going to hit the plus sign. Okay, now it's going to create a brand new character, and it's going to say, what geometry do you want included in this character? So select your mesh, select Bob, add him in the plus sign, right? So there we go. We have him now. Now we're going to say, okay, go ahead and create the guides. Now, there's a lot of different settings under the guides. If you want different amount of spine, neck joints, things like that, that makes sense. Hip translation, I recommend you don't do that unless you really need it. But the other thing's totally fine to mess with. And obviously, it's okay for you to create your own rig manually as well. So I'm going to hit create and update. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a whole bunch of joints. If you've rigged a lot, you know this is by no means perfect, right? Like, one thing you would definitely want to make sure of is that the root bone, which if you don't know what a root bone is, in game rigging, it is extremely common that there is a root bone that is then connected to the hip joint, because this is what the game engine is essentially saying is where the character is. It's at this particular location. This is just displaying off that location, which, if you think about it, programmers need to know, and the game engine needs to know to calculate ground height and all sorts of different things, right? This is required for game rigging, for real-time rigging. I wouldn't say required, but holy moly, you're making your life harder if you don't. So that's really common. You'll also notice, though, that obviously a lot of these joints are not anywhere close to the best placement, and that's okay. They don't have to be perfect for our tests, but I am going to clean them up using Quick Rig. So obviously this joint, I'm going to move it down, make sure that it's relatively centered within the ankle joint. And then to mirror that over, since I used the left one, what you do is you click this thing where you say use selected guides as source for mirroring the left to the right. So when I click that, it immediately does the other one for me. If I started on the right and I'm like, wow, that is way off, that is not on the knee, move it onto the knee. Definitely needs to be moved forward. That's close enough for what we're doing. We're not making a beautiful character. We're doing the project process. So now I'm going to mirror it from the right to the left, right? Pretty standard, pretty straightforward. I probably want to move this a little bit. Honestly, kind of want to move that just a tiny bit down. These are way off, so we're going to move them. Just trying to get it to center of mass in that area. Same thing here. And this one, which actually isn't terrible for what it is. The shoulder joint, move it slightly. The collabs are pretty off, but this character has like weird proportions, which is kind of why. Move that up. Move this one up quite a bit. That's pretty good for the purposes of what we're doing. I know some of you riggers are like, oh my God, that's fine. It's driving me crazy. Again, we're not doing this for real production. And if you are, obviously spend a lot more time on your rig. Now that that's good, I can hit create and update skeleton. So immediately it's going to connect everything. It's going to create all the control curves for me. And I'm pretty good to go, except I haven't done any skin weighting yet. So you can do default skin weighting by hitting the skinning create update button. So we can see right here, if I move this, it moves the skeleton, but not the actual mesh. I would definitely have to skin it. So if I hit create and update, now it's moving the mesh. Under the attribute editor, you will notice that joint orients are very, very consistent on both sides. Like obviously it's mirrored. And in many cases, you'll see that it's pretty clean overall, right? I've seen a lot of rigs where these things will be slightly off. And yeah, that's just good rigging practice that you're making them the same. But I cannot stress enough how important it is in games. Because what you're essentially creating that's massively different between film and games is you're creating lots of little short animations, right? And they're going to be blended together by the game engine. And if something isn't quite right on the base default pose, you're going to start getting really weird things when it tries to do IKs in real time. You're going to get really weird things when the programmers are trying to do stuff with it where they mirror it over and stuff like that. It needs to be really, really clean. And I encourage you massively, all riggers, I encourage you, if you create your own rig, and even something like this, in a real production, you should do default skin weighting, and it's going to be the ugliest thing ever. We all know it doesn't work amazing. But test it. Test it in the game engine. Start moving your stuff around. If you already have blend trees set up, which we're going to talk about later, test them. Test them early on before you do a tremendous amount of skin weighting, only to find out some of your bones have problems. We know that we can transfer those over, but we also know that that does not work perfectly, and there's always a lot of cleanup. So just stressing that early on, be really, really careful. Do lots of tests. Don't spend weeks on your rig to only then test it and realize that there are problems. And the next thing we're going to do is export this out to test it. Like I said, at minimum, we're just going to do a test of what it is like when it's a skeletal mesh in a static pose in the engine. Does everything export correctly and import correctly? So I'm going to grab the mesh and all of the rigging data. So like all of the bones, the control curves, everything. That's fine. We are going to export selection. This time we're going to just export over skbob again, and it's going to say it already exists. Yes. So now we're going to go into Unreal. We're going to delete out Bobby. And we're also going to go ahead and delete these two, because they were technically static meshes that we were just testing with. We're going to import him brand new. So reset everything to defaults. Says, yes, it is a skeletal mesh. Excellent, right? That's really, really good. Right now, we're not dealing with animations. None of that matters. I'm just going to leave the material stuff alone. You may need to change that based on your pipeline, but there we go. Now we have our skeletal mesh, the material it brought in, a physics asset, which it creates by default. If you're wondering what physics assets are used for, it's used for the two most common things, ragdolling and hitboxes. And then we have the skeleton, which you can consider as kind of the rig. So the mesh, the rig, and the physics asset, they're all here. Hit Control-Shift-S to save everything. And let's drag in skbob, and he looks like he's working. He looks like he's here. Everything is good. There's one last thing we're going to test. We're going to open up the skeleton. So you notice when you open it up, it will only show the bones that you have selected. And since we kind of want to see them all for testing purposes, you might think, oh, we'll select them all. I wish it was that simple. No, instead you need to go to character at the top of the viewport for this view and go to bones and set it to all hierarchy. And that will show you all the bones. Now, one of the things that I'm doing this for is to test to make sure that the root bone is correctly controlling everything, that it is, this reference point is connected to the hips. So yeah, that all is looking really, really good. It looks like we could even mess with this in here. We know that it is working. That's great. That is step one.